From KGW News, this is Straight Talk with Laurel Porter.
Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Laurel Porter. Now that the pandemic is behind us, the Portland Metro region's economy has reached a new normal. That's the conclusion of the Portland Metro Chamber's 2024 State of the Economy report. Last year here on Straight Talk, we looked at the region's economy right after the pandemic, and authors described it then as a doozy. A sizable number of people had pulled up roots and left Multnomah County. Foot traffic in downtown Portland was weak, apartment construction had slowed, and there was significant damage to the area's reputation. That led Oregon Governor Tina Kotek to create a task force to try to improve conditions in Portland's central city. In this week's episode of Straight Talk, we bring back our panel of experts to see if things have improved. What is the new normal in the Portland metro region? What kind of future do residents want? And how do we get there? Welcome back to our panel, Andrew Hone, the president and CEO of the Portland Metro Chamber, formerly known as the Portland Business Alliance. Michelle Neese, president of DHM Research, and Dr. Mike Wilkerson, partner and director of analytics at Echo Northwest. Welcome back to Straight Talk. It's so nice to have you all here.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
So let's set the stage with a look at the report by the numbers. And jobs in the Portland metro region grew by 1.3%. That's below the national average. The leisure and hospitality sector grew 4.1%, but that's slower than the 10.4% right after the pandemic ended in 2022. Professional services, manufacturing, and information sectors lost 11,000 jobs. And there's an 8% premium to live in Portland when adjusting for median household income, driven mostly by the high cost of living. And local taxes grew by 26% between 2010 and 2020. With those numbers in mind, Andrew, what do we mean when we say the new normal?
Sure. I think it's important that everybody understand we've been so consistently comparing ourselves to 2019 because that was the last full year of a normal economy, prior to when the pandemic and the health closures and some of the violence we saw on our streets occurred. And so doing that, we need to understand that 2023 was the last year that any headwinds from public health closures ended. And we have to start benchmarking ourselves to 2024 because no longer can we say it was the pandemic that's causing our challenges. This is the economy we have today, and it's time to start looking forward.
And we're going to start looking forward right now. But Mike, one of the big things that was troubling in last year's report was the number of people who had left the metro region. What are we seeing now?
Unfortunately, I think we're seeing essentially the same. At the state level, we have data now that suggests in 2023 we lost population for the entirety of the state. And that's very atypical. That's 2 years in a row. Prior to that, it had been since World War II since we'd lost population, and only 5 times ever in the state's history. And so when we look at the metro region, we unfortunately don't have 2023 data yet. However, if the state lost population in 2023, it's very likely that the metro did. And so that would be now 3 years of population loss. And I think for us, what's crucially important is there's 2 parts of population. There's natural change and there's in-migration. And natural change is demographically based and just pretty much moves on its own. There's not a whole lot we can do. And unfortunately, we've now tipped into negative change. So more people are dying every year in our state and in our metro than are being born. And so we're entirely reliant on people moving to this region. And so when we look at the data, that's what's more troubling is we actually have net out migration. And this particularly concentrated in the Oregon side of the metro. So when we think Portland, there's the Oregon side, there's Clark County. And Clark County is continuing to grow almost as it had for the last decade. Whereas in Multnomah County, the last 2 years we have data, 2021 and 2022, almost 10,000 more people left the county than moved into the county.
So why do we think this is happening, and how important is it to reverse that trend?
It's a great question. I think, unfortunately, we don't know all the reasons why. Michelle, I think, could be very helpful here in surveying people who are coming and going. But I think we have some strong indications about what's going on. I think part of that is overall, our affordability as a region has continued to decrease over time. And so it's increasingly challenging when people are looking at places to move, that Portland is no longer that opportunity where we have our natural amenities, we have all the things people come to know and love, but now it's affordability is a knock against us rather than a benefit. I think the other piece is, as we've seen, and we'll talk about more, the tax value proposition continues to erode. And so when we look at taxes continuing to increase and we see some patterns around movement, that has a lot to do with what's going on.
Well, let's talk to Michelle about how people are feeling about things, because one of the reasons people may be leaving the area is because of the way they feel about their economic opportunities. So you did a poll in December, DHM Research did of 500 likely voters. What did you find about how they're feeling about their economic opportunities?
We asked a couple different questions. One is, how well off are you now compared to 2 years ago? And what we saw is that unlike previous years where most people, or the most common answer was, we're about the same, this year the most common answer was, we're feeling worse off. And definitely one of the things that says to me is, even if wages for have gone up, that cost of living issue that Mike mentioned is really hitting people so that they feel that they're falling behind rather than moving forward. And that's particularly true for people who have lower incomes, for example. And also in this case, it's particularly true for people who live in Washington, Clackamas counties, which was a little bit of a surprise to us.
And also, for the first time, you saw something with the positive versus negative perceptions about people's economic opportunities. What did you see?
Right. So that question is, compared to 2 years ago, so it's looking back. We also asked them looking forward, what opportunities do you see here? And for the first time in the past several years, or ever since we've been doing this work with the Metro Chamber, more people said their opportunities are poor versus good. And so that, of course, is very troubling. And again, that's particularly true for lower income voters and our people of color.
Well, let's talk about the opportunities and jobs, Mike. What do we see when it comes to jobs? And there was a pretty big shift, wasn't there?
Yeah, so historically, Portland has been the beneficiary of a strong economy. And so when we look out at jobs, the Portland Metro's percentage of job growth exceeds the U.S. average historically in every year of an upturn. Conversely, when the economy turns for the worse, we are hit more severely. And that played out through the pandemic and early in the recovery, the last 2 years, so 2021, 2022, we saw job growth exceeding the national average. What we saw in 2023, I think, is too early to say is definitively a trend, but certainly is an indicator that's not positive, which is our economy grew less than the U.S. average. And that's very different than we've seen at really any time in the recent history.
And which sectors saw growth and which had kind of an off year?
Yeah, I think, again, I would put it in the not so great news camp. When you're thinking about the economy, what you want to see are your most productive sectors growing. And unfortunately, that's the opposite of what we're seeing today, which is our job losses are concentrated in our generally highest compensated and most productive sectors in professional and business services, in information, which is roughly the tech sector, and in manufacturing. And so when we see 2,000 or 3,000 jobs losses in those, and we see gains in government and in healthcare and in leisure and hospitality, certainly we want to see job gain everywhere, but it's particularly, I think, troublesome when we see that concentration. And as we get into talking about downtown, a lot of those are office-centric jobs as well. And so at a time when we're facing unprecedentedly high vacancy rate and we're losing thousands of jobs in office, that again, I think is a compounding factor.
So Andrew, weigh in here from all that we've heard so far. What should we take away from this?
Yeah, well, first off, you don't want your government sector, and that's not no disrespect to the government sector, to be leading the way in job creation. The other thing that's important to note on the jobs front is how we are creating and losing businesses. And the study also finds that we are creating less businesses than we are losing. And I think the question about how do we look forward, this is a small business town. We need to be generating more new businesses and supporting the growth of entrepreneurs in our community. And so the big takeaway here is we're at an inflection point as an economy looking forward. We need to correct some of these losses, as Mike and Michelle both mentioned, that we need to obviously reverse trends in this job market right now to have a more prosperous community for all of Portland. That's just fact.
Well, Michelle, what did your poll find out about how people feel about the direction the region's going in? Wrong direction versus right direction. What did you find out?
Well, as has been true for the past few years, the majority of people think we're headed in the wrong direction, which, overall is a pretty sobering feedback to our electeds.
Well, if policy leaders are making some positive changes or trying, like let's just say the Central City Task Force that the governor started, how long does it take for that shift in voter sentiment to show up in your polls? Is there a lag time?
There's definitely a lag time, and of course I can't predict the future. What I did notice when I went back, when we see historically two big drops in voter sentiment happened around 9/11 and the 2008 recession. And in both cases, it was about 2 years of drops followed by a 4-year slow increase up. So one thing is negative perceptions drop much quicker than positive ones come back. And so we can expect to be in for a little bit of a wait here while the public begins to believe and see and trust in the progress that's being made.
Because we did go up a little bit from last year, right? A couple of percentage points.
Yep, a little bit. I kind of interpret that as a wait and see, right? So it's good that it's not going down anymore, but it's a little bit of a wait and see.
Well, let's talk about this premium that there is to live in Portland compared to other cities. An 8% premium I talked about at the top. Mike or Andrew, want to jump in here and talk about the cost of living and what that means?
Yeah, again, as I mentioned, early on around this used to be, and not 30 or 40 years ago, 10 to 12 years ago, right around the average affordable place for the country. And so when we look at this over time, now we see on average it costs 8% more to live here than it does on an average place in the US. And that's largely driven by our lack of housing affordability. And so when you look at our housing today costs roughly 30% more than the US average. And while that is not great news, what I would say is potentially the green shoot there is we have kind of held steady and actually improved slightly in the last few years. And so while we are still very unaffordable, we were continuing to get worse every year up until about 2018. And since then, we've actually come down a few percentage points. So while we are still very unaffordable, largely driven by housing, we're kind of holding steady in that place, which I think is, again, an indication of building more housing really helps here. And as the economy stagnates, again, unfortunately, that kind of brings things closer together as well.
And you mentioned taxes earlier, and that affects people's budgets. So what are they saying, Michelle, in your poll about taxes? How are they feeling about the area's taxes?
Well, of course, it's not a surprise. 7 in 10 say taxes are too high. Clearly, almost none of us like to pay taxes. What's more instructive, I think, is that percentage has gone up 8 percentage points from last year.
And we're seeing something really surprising, too, that your poll showed that Portlanders are more upset about taxes than people in other counties. And that, Andrew, is really different from the reputation that Portlanders have, the old sort of adage that Portlanders never saw a tax they didn't like.
So true.
What's going on here?
Yeah, I think that should be, that's a big headline, right? That for the first time, Multnomah County residents are more upset about taxes than their suburban peers. So there's a huge message there. Everyone knows that last year, Multnomah County residents defeated a new tax 80% to 20%. You ask the question, when has anyone agreed on 80% on anything in our community, let alone defeating a new tax? So the point that Mike was making earlier about the value proposition in taxes has obviously been eroded, and that should be sending a message about when people think about new taxes, certainly they should be contemplating these numbers.
And how about, Mike, how Portland compares to other cities? I mentioned at the top that Portland saw a 26% increase in taxes from 2010 to 2020, driven largely by those voter-approved measures. How does that compare to other cities?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. For us in this report, we've always compared ourselves and benchmarked relative to other places. So we can understand a number is just not a number in a vacuum. It matters relative to that. And this year, we re-evaluated our peers. And this is something we do commonly every 5 years. And I think it was a very opportune time, as Andrew mentioned, as we're coming out of the pandemic, to establish kind of a new normal trajectory and look at benchmarking against regions that are experiencing similar characteristics to us. And so in that, we now have Denver, Minneapolis, Milwaukee, Sacramento, and Seattle we always compare ourselves to, but they're not necessarily our data-informed peer, they're more of our regional peer, and so we look at them. And what we find by looking at those peers is over the last 10 years, our growth was second only to Seattle. So that 26% growth is actually more than double even the next highest peer. And so I think this is, again, suggestive of that big change that Andrew mentions in terms of the sentiment, also backed up by the fact that there's been big movements in revenue collection.
And people would like to see those taxes going to help address some of the big problems that we have. So Michelle, what are the top concerns that people told you about in the survey?
Well, homelessness, again, tops the list as it has for the past several years, followed by public safety. What we saw this year, which was a little bit newer, was in the top 3 was people mentioning drugs and drug use as a concern. And then housing affordability, which again, the case can be made that that's part of the homelessness problem as well.
So as we look at all this, Andrew, and we look at some of the troubling trends, some of the negativity, did this all start, you mentioned the pandemic and before the pandemic in 2019, did this all start with the pandemic or did it start before? And are we at a point where we're seeing a reset?
Yeah, let's talk about going back to that new normal. We can no longer blame the public health closures. This started 2016, 2017, you'll see it over and over. You actually see it across the board, both the data in the economy and in the polling. It shows this erosion happening over time from 16 and 17. What the pandemic did is put us on the fast track to exacerbate these issues. And so what people should take away is that it is policy that caused many of these challenges. And so it is policy that can help us out of these problems.
So what do regional leaders need to do?
Well, the good news is they have enough money. As you just heard, we've seen enormous increases in taxes. But what we do is, I think this is the keystone. We have structural problems with how we are spending it. We'll see these dedicated taxes that are spilling over in revenue, not spending enough of it, and you'll see general funds genuinely starved of resources to do the core things like safety and parks and streets and roads. So what I think we need to be talking very seriously about is structural reform of our taxes in this region to make sure we're applying those resources to the areas that Michelle is pointing out that are core to our livability standards in our community.
Well, it's time for us to take a break. Coming up, we'll take a closer look at what the report found about Portland's Central City. We're back in 2 minutes. Welcome back to Straight Talk. I'm Laurel Porter. Downtowns and central cities are vital to regional economies. Surveys show Portlanders love their neighborhoods and want them reborn and reimagined for future generations. We take a look at the state of Portland's Central City with our panel. Welcome once again to the Portland Metro Chamber's Andrew Hone, Dr. Mike Wilkerson from Echo Northwest, and Michelle Neese from DHM Research. Once again, it's great to have you all here. Let's start off with foot traffic, Andrew. The 2024 report showed that Portland's foot traffic was up. Are you encouraged by that?
Absolutely. It goes back to how we're comparing ourselves. And if you look back to 2019, we're still not at those levels. And we are unlikely to see them because of the nature of our office market here. But if you compare ourselves year on year, it's up. And these are exciting data points for all of us because I think everyone can tell that downtown's become more vibrant. Our events are back. So it's something to be celebrated, and when you compare ourselves against our new set of peer regions, we're actually showing that our growth is better than most of our competitors. So I think there's a good news story there about our center city, and everyone's feeling it. Well,
we're glad to hear some good news. Good news here. And what did you find out in the poll? What are people telling you, Michelle, about who's coming back downtown, how often?
Right. So in our poll, slightly more than half of the area residents had visited downtown in the past 30 days. And again, this was in December, so there's holiday events, celebrations, shopping going on. And we did know that we found that younger people are coming back more often. And of course, people who live in the city of Portland are more likely to visit downtown city of Portland. And so the one thing we did see where there is an opportunity is the residents outside of the city of Portland, more of them compared to last year had not visited downtown at all. So that's the one area where there's room to tell that story more. And certainly when we hear from the businesses, when we've shared this work, they want to know how to share that story of the progress being made and the good things that are happening to entice more visitors.
How do you do that? How do you reach out, Andrew, to people outside of the city?
Well, I think everybody likes a comeback story, and I think it starts right here, with our media partners. And I think we have seen a change in the attitude of coverage. Things like the Ritz-Carlton opening, We know the Soho House is coming. So this mythology of Portland being uninvestable is certainly false. And we're proving that out by the ability to do the big things. And so I think when you get those stories out there, we're seeing the responsiveness to it. And we know the hook is on our events. For example, if you were at the Portland Winter Lights Festival, you could not walk around downtown Portland. And so I think as we capture people through those gateway experiences, we tend to see positive comeback stories where they will return to our downtown and continue to support our central city.
Well, another important part of the central city is the jobs to housing units ratio. In Portland, it's 4-to-1. Mike, help us understand what that means and why it's important.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the new normal is certainly hybrid work. We know today that roughly 30% of all days worked are at home. And this is something that central cities are grappling with across the country. And so I think what the research is showing, and Portland falls into this camp certainly, is places, right, small places, neighborhoods that are more of a mix of uses were more resilient coming out of the pandemic and are doing better. And that just makes sense, right? Today, the new normal for office is you're in the office Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And so if no one is out and about walking around, how do you support a thriving place that feels safe and that can support a retail environment that's conducive to what people want when they're out and about? And so that housing is really that crucial intervention. And so Portland, for a long time, has been a national leader in thinking about mixed use, active transportation, et cetera. And so when we look at our peer regions, we're performing about the best of all of them. So that means we have 4 jobs for every 1 housing unit in our overall central city. I think for us, the opportunity is our downtown is 20-to-1. And our successful neighborhoods like the Pearl, South Waterfront, et cetera, are more like 1-to-1. So it's, I think, finding more consistent balance across the central city is that opportunity to kind of help with this revival and resiliency.
Well, in addition to that, the leasing volume is down. You talked about work from home. It's about half what it was, Andrew, in the years before the pandemic. With that, with the foot traffic, you're encouraged by that, with the jobs to housing ratio, help us understand where Portland is now and where it's going.
Well, it's struggling obviously with its commercial office market, and we need to be supportive of that. And if you took note, yesterday the City Council passed an expansion of the business license tax incentive program for people to sign leases in our center city, which is huge because incentives were not exactly a popular thing pre-pandemic. But I think if you're asking what's the future of our downtown, it's a 24/7 neighborhood like every other part of our city, which is so fabulous. We have great neighborhoods. Downtown needs to establish itself as a neighborhood, and you do that by adding housing, and that will support the commercial office market as well. So that's where the future lies, is a more vibrant 24/7 neighborhood.
We have to talk about safety because a lot of people are concerned about how they feel. Do they feel safe in downtown? What did you find out in your survey, Michelle?
Right, so we're showing you here the number of people who felt unsafe, and about half feel unsafe during the day, and 8 in 10 feel unsafe at night. There's a few things to note about that. One is people in Portland are more likely to feel safe during the day, and we also know they're more likely to visit. So I think there is a feedback loop here. Is if you go downtown during the day, you can maybe see improvements and you'll start to gain that feeling of safety, seeing other people around, you're not alone. And where there's still some opportunity is definitely around safety at night, where even people in Portland are also the majority feeling.
And people
unsafe.
have told us, I'm sure some people at home feel this way too, that they don't think that people are going to come back and live downtown until some of these core issues are addressed. Homelessness, drug use, crime, affordability. How do you address those? How do you build confidence so people want to come back? And what do policy leaders need to do as we wrap this up, Andrew?
Yeah, so I think the big picture here takeaway is that in 2016, 2017, we can go back to that inflection point. We could do no wrong in the national media. We were the darlings of an economy that was growing, population was being added. But we were making very poor choices. We were not investing in our center city. We were making housing more difficult to build. We are uninvesting in our criminal justice system. All the things that make Portland a good place to be, a safe place to be, we're making poor choices. Now, when we can do seemingly no right in the national media, we are making great choices. And so it doesn't feel that way right now, but what people need to understand is we are on track with our policymakers making smart decisions. Voters are making smart decisions right now. So we are setting the foundations for a better future, and they start with livability. That is what Portland is known for. It is a livable place. It should be an affordable place, and certainly a safe one, and that will support a central city and an overall economic recovery.
It's going to be interesting to see what your survey shows next year, if it shows a shift in how people are feeling about some of these choices that are being made. I want to thank you all for being here again. Andrew Home, Michelle Neese, Mike Wilkerson, always a pleasure to have you here. Look forward to the next State of the Economy report. And if you'd like to read that report for yourself, you can find it on the Portland Metro Chamber's website, also in the article about this on our website. Once again, thank you to my guests. Always a pleasure to have them here. Thank you for watching. Join me next week when my guest is candidate for Multnomah County District Attorney Nathan Vasquez. We'll see you next week for Straight Talk.